The message arrived on a Tuesday morning, innocent enough, just a notification from my grandson Malik lighting up my phone screen. At 72, I'd grown accustomed to his sweet, random texts, blurry photos of their golden retriever, memes he thought would make me smile, or simply love you, Grandma. But this message contained something different. A video. I pressed play without hesitation, expecting perhaps another glimpse into his teenage world. Instead, I found myself staring at my daughter Camille, wineglass in hand, standing in the very kitchen I'd paid for when she couldn't afford groceries, let alone granite countertops. She's honestly such a liability, Camille's voice cut through the recording, sharp and dismissive. Her friends, those polished women who'd never acknowledged my existence, erupted in theatrical laughter. What does she even contribute? Camille continued, oblivious to Malik recording from behind the refrigerator. She's basically a guest in her own grave. More laughter. More venom. More confirmation of what I'd been trying to ignore for years. I set the phone down carefully, my hands steady despite the earthquake building in my chest. The kitchen, where I stood, the same kitchen where she'd performed her cruelty, suddenly felt foreign. The marble backsplash I'd selected, the custom cabinets I'd funded, the very foundation of this house I'd saved from foreclosure 8 years ago, all of it had become a stage for my own erasure. That night, I didn't cry. Tears would have been too easy, too expected. Instead, I sat in what Camille generously called the guest suite, the room I'd been relegated to after sacrificing my own home to save hers. I pulled out my laptop and began researching. The story of how I'd arrived here wasn't complicated. 8 years ago, Camille's divorce had left her drowning in debt. The mortgage was in default, the bank threatening foreclosure, and her ex-husband had vanished with half their assets. She'd stood in my modest apartment, tears streaming down her face, begging for help. "I can't lose the house, Mama. Malik needs stability. I need you." I'd liquidated my retirement, sold my condo, and moved in to help her rebuild. It was supposed to be temporary, a bridge until she found her footing. But temporary became permanent, and gratitude became entitlement. My sacrifice became invisible. I'd watched her transform from a struggling single mother into a woman who hosted elaborate dinner parties, drove luxury cars, and spoke about our house as if she'd built it with her own hands. Meanwhile, I became the woman in the back room, tolerated but not celebrated, needed but not respected. The video had simply confirmed what I'd been too afraid to acknowledge. I had become a liability in the life I'd made possible. But instead of breaking me, that realization awakened something I'd forgotten existed, my own power. The next morning, I called Lionel Gaines, an attorney I'd found through careful research. His office sat between a nail salon and a soul food restaurant, unpretentious but professional. When I explained what I needed, he didn't flinch. An irrevocable trust. He repeated, making notes. Complete control over your assets, with your grandson as the ultimate beneficiary. Everything, I confirmed. The house, the bank accounts, all of it. I want it beyond her reach. He leaned back in his chair. "Mrs. Shaw, this is a significant decision. Once we establish this trust, there's no going back." "I've been going back for 8 years, I said quietly. "It's time to move forward." The paperwork took 3 days. 3 days of careful documentation, of transferring ownership, of building walls around everything I'd worked for. When I signed the final document, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. Camille noticed nothing. She was too busy preparing for another dinner party, another opportunity to display the lifestyle my money had purchased. She flitted through the house like a hummingbird, all nervous energy and manufactured grace. "It's going to be amazing," she gushed over breakfast. Regional directors, potential investors, the whole crowd. I sipped my coffee and nodded appropriately. "Sounds wonderful. Oh, and Mama." She paused, her smile becoming strained. "It's going to be pretty upscale, so I think it would be best if you stayed in your room during the event." "You understand." I understood perfectly. I was the liability. "Remember, of course, dear," I said, matching her artificial sweetness. "I wouldn't want to embarrass you." She looked relieved, probably expecting the usual compliance. She had no idea she'd just lit the fuse on her own downfall. The dinner party was scheduled for Saturday. On Thursday, I visited the Willow Grove retirement community not because I needed to, but because I wanted to explore my options. The facility was beautiful. Gardens, a library, activities, and most importantly, independence. I signed a lease that afternoon. Friday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Marcus Dunn, an attorney I didn't recognize, arrived with a briefcase and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Shaw, I'm here on behalf of your daughter. She asked me to deliver some documents for your review." I invited him in, maintaining my grandmother demeanor while my mind raced. The envelope he handed me was thick, official-looking, and absolutely predictable. After he left, I opened it in the privacy of my room. Power of attorney documents. Property. Transfer forms. Financial authorizations. Everything needed to strip me of legal control over my own life, already prepared for my signature. The audacity was breathtaking. She'd actually believed I would sign away my autonomy without question. I photographed every document and emailed them to Mr. Gaines. His response was immediate. "This is attempted elder abuse. Keep everything as evidence." Saturday arrived with all the fanfare Camille had orchestrated. Caterers bustled through the house, transforming it into a showcase of success she'd never earned. Flowers appeared, wine was staged, and the woman who'd called me a liability prepared to host a party in the home I'd saved. I spent the day in my room, listening to the sounds of preparation below. As evening approached, I heard cars arriving, voices mixing with laughter, the clinking of glasses. Camille's performance was beginning. At precisely 9 o'clock, I emerged from my room, dressed in my finest outfit, a deep blue dress I'd bought for my own retirement party years ago. I walked downstairs to find Camille's gathering in full swing. The conversation died as I appeared. Camille's face went white, then red, then something approaching purple. "Mama," she hissed, rushing toward me. "What are you doing? We discussed this." "We did," I agreed, my voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. "You told me to stay out of sight because I was a liability." The silence was deafening. Her guests, those important investors and regional directors, shifted uncomfortably. "I think it's time everyone knew the truth," I continued, producing a copy of the trust documents. "This house, which you've been presenting as your success story, belongs to me. The mortgage you've been unable to pay, I've been covering it. The lifestyle you've been flaunting, built on my sacrifice." Camille's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted. "I understand that you called me a liability while living in my house. I understand that you tried to have me sign away my rights without reading the documents. I understand that you've been planning to erase me from my own life." One of her guests, a distinguished man in an expensive suit, stepped forward. "I think we should leave," he said quietly. "Yes," I agreed. "You should. This party is over." The exodus was swift and silent. Within minutes, the house was empty except for Camille, Malik, and me. Camille stood in the center of her ruined showcase, tears streaming down her face. "You've destroyed everything," she whispered. "No," I said firmly. "I've saved everything. For myself. For Malik. From you." Malik, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward. "I'm proud of you, Grandma." Camille whirled on him. "You knew about this." "I sent her the video," he said simply. "Someone had to." The next morning, I moved into Willow Grove. The retirement community welcomed me with genuine warmth, and for the first time in years, I was surrounded by people who saw me as Evelyn Shaw, not as an obligation or a burden. Malik visited regularly, bringing his sketchpad and stories from school. He'd chosen to stay with his mother, but he understood my decision. More importantly, he respected it. The house went into foreclosure within 2 months. Camille's credit was destroyed, her social circle evaporated, and her carefully constructed image crumbled. She called repeatedly, begging for help, for money, for another chance. I never answered. The final chapter came 6 months later. Camille had moved into a small apartment across town, far from the affluent neighborhood where she'd once held court. She'd found work as a receptionist in East work, perhaps the first in years. Through mutual friends, I heard she'd been telling people that her mother had abandoned her, that I'd been cruel and vindictive. The narrative painted me as the villain in her story of victimhood. I didn't correct the record. Let her believe what she needed to believe. One evening, while I was tending to my small garden at Willow Grove, Malik appeared with a letter in his hand. "It's from Mom," he said, sitting beside me on the bench. "She wants to apologize. Says she's learned her lesson." I continued watering my tomatoes. "What do you think?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I think she's learned that actions have consequences. Whether she's learned respect, that's different." "Very wise," I said, proud of the young man he was becoming. Are you going to forgive her? I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness isn't about her, Malik, it's about me. I've already forgiven her for being selfish, for being cruel, for taking my love for granted. But forgiveness doesn't mean I have to subject myself to more of the same treatment. He nodded, understanding beyond his years. She's still my daughter, I continued. I'll always love her. But love without respect is just obligation, and I'm done living on borrowed gratitude. As the sun set over the garden, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the fragile peace of avoidance, but the solid peace of respect. I'd spent 8 years trying to buy my daughter's love with my sacrifice. I'd mistaken her need for my affection, her dependence for gratitude. The woman who'd called me a liability had been living off the very foundation I'd provided. But in the end, I'd discovered something more valuable than her approval. My own worth. The tomatoes I'd planted were beginning to ripen, the result of patience, care, and proper conditions. Unlike the relationship I'd tried to cultivate with Camille, these plants responded to authentic nurturing. Malik stayed for dinner that night, and we sat in my small apartment sharing stories and laughter. He showed me his latest drawings, deep sketches of the life we'd built together, the good memories we'd preserved, despite everything. I'm glad you stood up to her, he said as he prepared to leave. So am I replied, meaning it completely. After he left, I sat in my comfortable chair with a cup of tea, looking out at the garden lights twinkling in the darkness. The silence wasn't empty, it was full of possibility, of dignity, of choices made with wisdom rather than fear. I thought about the woman I'd been 8 years ago, the woman who'd given up everything to save her daughter's dreams. That woman had been generous, loving, and naive. She'd believed that sacrifice would be recognized, that love would be reciprocated, that doing the right thing would be rewarded. I didn't regret being that woman. Her generosity had taught me about love. Her sacrifice had shown me what I was capable of. Her naivety had eventually led to her wisdom. But I was no longer that woman. I was Evelyn Shaw, 72 years old, independent, respected, and finally free. I was no longer anyone's liability. I was my own asset. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, in my own home, surrounded by my own choices. The morning light filtered through curtains I'd selected, illuminating furniture I'd purchased, in a space that was entirely mine. I made coffee in my small kitchen, humming an old song I'd forgotten I knew. Through the window, I could see other residents tending to their gardens, reading on benches, walking dogs, living lives of quiet dignity. This was what I'd been missing all those years. The simple pleasure of existing without justification, of taking up space without apology, of being valued for who I was rather than what I could provide. My phone buzzed with a text from Malik. Morning, Grandma. Hope you're having a good day. Love you. I smiled, typing back. The best day. Love you too. And it was true. It was the best day because it was mine. Finally, completely, unapologetically, mine. The liability had become the asset. The woman in the back room had claimed the front door. The sacrifice had become the victory. And in the end, that was the most important lesson of all. That love without self-respect is just servitude, and freedom without boundaries is just chaos. I'd learned to love myself enough to demand better, to respect myself enough to walk away, to value myself enough to stop accepting less than I deserved. The video that had started at Malek's brave recording of his mother's cruelty had been the catalyst for my transformation. But the real change had come from within. From the moment I decided that being called a liability was unacceptable, that being treated as disposable was intolerable. I'd reclaimed my power not through revenge, but through taught my daughter a lesson not through cruelty, but through consequences. I'd saved my grandson not by fighting for him, but by modeling dignity. In the end, the greatest gift I'd given myself wasn't freedom from my daughter's manipulation, it was freedom to be myself. Fully, and without apology. The story wasn't over. Camille would continue living her life, hopefully learning from her mistakes. Malik would grow up, carrying the lessons he'd learned from both of us. And I would continue growing too, discovering new aspects of myself in this chapter of independence. But for now, it was enough to sit in my garden, to tend my plants, to live my life on my own terms. It was enough to be valuable to myself, respected by myself, loved by myself. The liability had learned her worth. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson of all.